My name is Sahar Aziz. I'm a law professor and Chancellor Associate Scholar at Rutgers University Law School. I'm also the executive director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, which is the fully first civil rights center at a U.S. law school that focuses on the civil human rights of Muslims, Arabs, and the South Asians here in the U.S. as well as abroad. And it is my distinct pleasure to be on this distinct panel. And thank you so much to the National Interest Foundation for inviting to participate. I thank the head of Zabudi and his team for all their hard work organizing this important event. So as an academic, I would be remiss not to use my position to try to frame the follow-up in hopes that my colleagues will add a little bit more details unique to the argument. So my comments today center on the two overarching questions that are frequently brought up in debates about human rights and U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and North Africa. The first is whether our country takes human rights seriously or merely uses human rights strategically to further geopolitical interests, easily our foes and our allies. The second is whether human rights impedes or enhances our interests in the region. So I'll start with the justifiable critique that our government participates in selective, politicized enforcement of human rights laws and policies to serve its geopolitical interests in furtherance of one goal: to remain the sole great power in the Middle East or in Africa, replacing the French and British after World War II. This geopolitical objective is addressed by 5 pillars. First, to retain control over the distribution and price of oil in the global market. Second, maintain over 30 military bases in the region. Third, to keep the Middle East as the largest purchaser of U.S. military equipment, accounting for 49% of all U.S. arms exports, with Saudi Arabia alone accounting for 18% of all military sales, totaling $9 billion between 2013 and 2017. Fourth, the unconditional support for the State of Israel and the U.S. outpost in the Middle East and North Africa. And finally, to ensure that all Arab leaders place U.S. geopolitical interests ahead of their own citizens in their foreign policy decisions. Hence, when we examine the response, or lack thereof, of our government to human rights violations through this great power paradigm, the contradictions between our lofty rhetoric domestically and our actions abroad make sense. Enforcing human rights against our nuclear enemies, such as Iran and Syria and Iraq before 2003, is a stick, while looking the other way when our allies violate human rights is the carrot in our geopolitical agenda. So a brief overview of the practices of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, or Israel, which my esteemed panelists will likely go into more detail, and I'll touch on this just quickly to show that the U.S. government consistently conducts business as usual in its relations, irrespective of our allies' human rights weapons. Egypt has imprisoned, since 2013, tens of thousands of political prisoners for the offenses such as insulting the president or insulting the judiciary or spreading false news after trials that lacked any semblance of due process there. Saudi Arabia butchers, literally, its dissident journalists, including Jamal Khashoggi, or conducts mass executions of 81 political dissidents for political offenses such as, quote, disrupting the social fabric and national cohesion of the country, end quote, and for participating in and inciting sit-ins and protests, end quote. United Arab Emirates convicts political dissidents in mass trials for calling for parliament, the democratic parliament, or if suspected of just mere association with the Muslim Brotherhood. Israel has established an elaborate system of apartheid that for over 60 years has dehumanized and collectively punished millions of Palestinians based on racist notions of Jewish supremacy and Arab inferiority. And each of these allies has a record of torturing its political prisoners through brutal violence,
denial of urgent medical care, or indefinite solitary confinement. Nevertheless, our government continues to conduct trade, sell military arms, and invite their rulers to the White House. And when our allied nations do not cooperate, our government officials suddenly discover the importance of human rights through mild condemnations and then temporary halts on a tiny fraction of foreign aid. In stark contrast, the U.S. government takes on the mantle of global human rights defender in its dealings with its stated enemies. The State Department publicly condemns Iran for, quote, brutal attacks of violence against peaceful protesters and an ongoing repression of the Iranian people. Our Congress issues resolutions stating, quote, condemning the Iranian regime's human rights abuses against the brave women and men of Iran peacefully demonstrating in more than 133 cities, end quote. And the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom denounces Iran's pursuit of death sentences on religiously grounded charges against protesters asserting their freedom of religion or belief. And all of this notwithstanding that our government, the United States government, issued a Muslim ban with the blessing of our Supreme Court. While simultaneously propping up authoritarians in allied countries, the United States government condemns the autocracy of Syria. The Assad regime's human rights violations are censored, as they should be, but similar violations are glossed over when our allies are the perpetrators. These glaring inconsistencies undermine the relevance of human rights law in U.S. foreign policy, making human rights merely a tool in the geopolitical toolkit as opposed to an international set of norms to which all countries must be held accountable, including the United States of America. So it is no surprise then that the Israeli government flippantly dismisses allegations of systemic racism that perpetuates massive seizures of Palestinian land and property, unlawful killings, forcible transfers, drastic movement restrictions, and the denial of nationality and citizenship to Palestinians. So this brings me to the second question of whether human rights impedes or enhances our interests in the region and within our own country. Why should we as citizens of this nation, paying taxes that fund our government's support, directly or indirectly, of regimes that violate human rights, even bother to care about human rights? The answer lies in the type of world and the type of country we want to live in. The biggest losers from the absence of human rights enforcement are civilians all over the world, including us, who can no longer rely on these universal norms to protect our shared humanity. For it is preserving this shared humanity that distinguishes between a world where raw power in the form of wealth, arms, and control defines how we treat each other as people and as nations. Human rights law sets the minimum threshold of dignity that we all deserve regardless of the circumstances of our birth, which country, which neighborhood, which parents, which race, which religion from which we belong. Failure to hold all nations accountable for human rights violations sends a clear message. The law does not matter. That is, might makes right. And once these rules are the norms, we reopen the same gates of hell that we saw in World War II when millions of Jews were marched into death camps to be slaughtered like animals. Genocide awaits at the end of the path that starts with the normalization of human rights violations, as we have witnessed in Burma against the Rohingya. When the rich and powerful can abuse you with impunity, the response is more violence, whether through insurgency, revolution, guerrilla warfare, or terrorism. Non-state actors respond in kind to abusive governments that stripped its citizens of their humanity. The result of permanent repression of political rights is a region rife with instability and conflict that is not contained to one country or region. And while this state of affairs may indeed enrich the U.S. defense industry as the demand for military weaponry increases, the conflicts have created fertile soil for global terrorist groups that target the United States, precisely because it props up nations that systematically violate human rights and deny their citizens basic political freedoms, either with our government's blessing or our neglect. If the 2-decade-long US-led global war on terror has taught us anything, it is that our own country is less safe and we, its citizens, are less free when national security becomes the guise under which we abandon the rule of law, including adherence to human rights laws. Falling for the same fear-mongering deployed by autocrats to justify human rights violations, we, the U.S. citizens, granted our government more authority to surveil, investigate, and prosecute individuals on account of their Muslim identity and their disagreement with our nation's foreign policy in Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Israel. And for more on that, I'll just put a plug in for my book, The Racial Muslim When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. So in our names and with our money, the US government tortured Muslims and Arabs in Abu Ghraib, in Guantanamo Bay, and CIA black sites, confirming what the people in the Middle East and North Africa have always believed. Human rights is merely a tool that Western states use against their political foes, not a set of universal norms that apply to everyone. Indeed, the global war on terror proved to be a boon for the autocrats across the globe, especially in the Middle East and North Africa, who need only label political dissidents as terrorists to legitimize the murder, torture, mass expulsion, or indefinite detention of individuals they deem a threat to their grip on power. So where does this leave us as citizens of an increasingly interconnected world, who in the age of social media and the internet can no longer claim ignorance of what our country is doing in our name and with our money? Supporting dictators, supporting apartheid, selectively defending the human rights of those who share the same identities as our elected officials, white and Judeo-Christian, while dehumanizing Arabs and Muslims at home and abroad. Now, to be sure, that we are today able to express our dissent without threat of arrest speaks to the promise that this land and this country holds in being an exemplar of political freedom. But let there be no mistake. When we walk out of this room, some of us will be vilified, we will be attacked, and we will be blacklisted by the media, by our elected officials, and by special interest groups for daring to be Muslim and Arab and critical of an American foreign policy that treats Palestinians as animals, not human beings. For daring to actually take seriously our nation's stated commitment to human rights for all, including Muslims and Arabs, regardless whether the violator is a geopolitical ally or our own nation. For it is we the people, not our government, who are left carrying the burden of guarding our shared universal humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.